So, hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the webinar called Methodology Matters, Deep Dive into Low Carbon Fertilizers, hosted by Webinar and with contributions from Atlas Agro. So while we do have a couple more viewers piling in, I would like to make a couple remarks before we start this off. So first and foremost, this webinar is being recorded. So the recording will be sent to all registered participants, and we hope to have it openly available on our website in the following week. Next, I would like to mention that we will have a Q&A segment towards the end of the webinar. So we have disabled the chat to avoid receiving any messages during when our speakers are speaking. But Kostas, if you could please skip a slide and a slide again. But at the bottom right of your screen, there is an activities button. If you follow and then see a Q&A section, this is the spot to ask all of your questions. Of course, we want to keep this as interactive as possible, and I'm sure there will be questions that come up. Do ask them there, and once we get to the Q&A segment, we will be answering those questions. Now, I'd like to really start picking it up. I would like to quickly introduce our speakers before I hand this over to Sijbrand. So today we have three fantastic speakers. We have Sijbrand Tieleman, our CEO and founder of Proba. Next, we have Dan Holmes from Atlas Agro, who is the president of Atlas Agro in North America. And we have Konstantinos Dimitriou, our consultant, expert, our scientist at Proba. So now the floor I would like to pass on to Sijbrand.
Thank you very much, Erna, and thank you everybody for joining and welcome. Really happy to have you all here. I will keep it very short. The floor today is specifically for my colleague who's sitting next to me, Konstantinos, and Dan, who will follow up in a few minutes, introducing what they are trying to do in Washington State, North America. I will just have a couple of slides to maybe introduce, I would say, the topic at hand. So you can do the next slide, please. Of course, we have a big problem as a globe, as a society, and I would say the fertilizer industry is somewhat responsible for a big part of this problem. 2.6 gigatons on a yearly basis are being emitted of CO2 equivalent emissions. So we need to try to decarbonize this, and that's what this event, this webinar is about. There's a lot of people who signed up, who registered, and there's also a lot of people in the webinar currently. So I think a lot of people are active there, and we try to do our part. Next slide, please. Emissions in the fertilizer industry are basically everywhere in the value chain of fertilizers. So there are lots of emissions when you produce fertilizers. There's lots of emissions, I would say, making the feedstocks for those fertilizers, but there's also a lot of emissions when using or applying fertilizers on the field. If you want to reduce them, I think we at Proba, we see two big avenues. Next slide, please. You can get rid of them on the field, for instance, by adopting more enhanced efficiency technologies, inhibitors or controlled release fertilizers, but you can also reduce a lot of emissions if you try to make low carbon fertilizers, so during the production. Next slide, please. So that's what we aim for to go into more depth today. And maybe before we start and give Dan the floor, there's a few, I would say, ways where you can incentivize those low carbon production technologies. One of them is the stick. So basically ask our governments to come up with more regulation. I think from Proba and I think most of us in this webinar, probably we don't really like a lot of regulation most of the time. So I think the preferable or maybe more friendly way is use the carrot. Basically, we need to invest. So there's a lot of capital, a lot of money involved. which can be paid for by all of us using subsidies. So then it's our taxpayer money, but it can also be done, I would say, in the supply chain. So participants, consumers, retailers, food companies, other companies active in the supply chain who basically pay more for a better product, either by paying more for the actual physical product or by paying I would say something for using carbon finance, which then could hopefully finance the interventions, the innovations that we need in order to decarbonize some of the industry. That's for today. So the methodology, but yeah, before we go into the methodology details, where Konstantinos will go into, first I would like to give the floor to Dan, because in the end we need people with a vision, a plan, and actually doing stuff. And I think Atlas Agro, we're really lucky and fortunate that we can work with them. Without them, I don't think we would be here, to be honest. But Dan can maybe tell a bit on what they're doing on the west coast of the United States. Dan, up to you. Thank you. You need to unmute Dan. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Hebran. I appreciate it. Yeah, can we go to our first slide? So my name is Dan Holmes. I lead the Atlas Agro team for North America. Atlas Agro is a green fertilizer startup founded in 2021. Our CEO, Peter Ospo, started the company with the idea that it would take a new company, one without existing fossil fuel assets, to rethink fertilizer markets and demonstrate the path forward. His experience as Chief Operating Officer for Yara and Group CEO of Eurochem, two of the world's largest fertilizer companies, helped him recruit a great team and raise hundreds of millions in capital, but markets are not transformed by individuals. We're grateful for partners like Proba, who are also working hard to put the pieces in place to make this a reality. So I appreciate the invite to talk on this webinar, share a bit more about our projects and our company. So next slide. And we might go through a couple of these quickly since Hebran covered some of this, but just to touch on the point how important fertilizer is for the world, not just for feeding a growing population, but for also doing it in an efficient way and preventing land use change. And so we all understand, I think probably on this call, how important fertilizers are. And next slide, but is to say, you know, how much carbon and greenhouse gas is associated with the production and use of fertilizers. So next slide. I think one thing that's interesting for people is to understand really what that means and what that embedded carbon looks like in products they use every day. And so as an example, in the case of a coffee, you buy a kilo of coffee, there's 750 grams approximately of carbon just associated with growing the beans for that bag of coffee. So clearly a big impact in the products we use every day. Next slide. And so at Atlas Agro, we can reduce the production emissions of fertilizer by more than 99%. And so we do this through the use of renewable energy and to make green hydrogen. You know, this concept is 100 years old, right? But it's really about making it economical. And in our case, we have several ways we do that. One of which is using intellectual property and patents that we have for reusing waste streams between individual process units. And I don't know, I keep losing the signal, but maybe that's on the other side. But using waste streams from the individual process units to improve the overall efficiency of the system by about 20%. So next slide. Our first project is the Pacific Green Fertilizer Project. So we recently completed our feed study. We've now received our environmental permits and we're moving quickly towards FID at the end of the year. And we expect this to be the first of its kind in the world when it comes online in the end of 2027. And the next slide. And as a company, we have large ambitions and intend to help rebuild the world's fertilizer infrastructure. and we expect to build 1 to 2 plants a year. Our second project in Uberaba, Brazil, is shortly behind our Pacific Green Fertilizer project, and should be starting its feed study shortly. Next slide. And so, yeah, we're grateful for partners like Proba who are working to help prepare markets for this transition. And yeah, anything we can do for Proba, we will. So thanks everyone for the time.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Thanks a lot, Dan. All right, so I'm Konstantinos from Proba, and now we will move on to the third part of this webinar, where we will focus on diving into the methodology that we are developing. And in this part, we will try to answer a few questions about methodologies. So first of all, what are they? Why do we need them? And basically, how can they bring value to the fertilizer and agriculture sectors? So without further ado, let's get right into it. First question, what is a greenhouse gas methodology? Basically, the definition is that it is a standardized approach for quantifying, monitoring, and verifying emission reductions of a greenhouse gas project. And you might be asking, what is a greenhouse gas project? Well, it is an initiative aimed at reducing emissions compared to what was happening before. And the purpose of the methodology is to give a way to calculate these emission reductions, so estimate the impact, but at the same time provide a guideline for designing such a project so that the emission reductions can get translated into carbon credits, for example. So what do we need? Why do we need greenhouse gas methodologies? Well, the answer is simple. They can support financing green innovation. Basically, innovation projects generally require some sort of investment. And to get this investment in such sort of projects, we can quantify the impact through the greenhouse gas methodology. And there are quite a few instruments that one can use to do this reduction. For example, we have the green premium, which is basically the extra cost on top of the price that you pay for a product, very similar that you buy bio milk, for example. But you have also a couple more options, for example, offsetting, so funding such projects that reduce emissions through carbon credits. And more interestingly, we have insetting, which is the same concept, but instead of selling those kind of credits anywhere, you can sell them in your own supply chain. So the added benefit here is that you reduce the scope 3 emissions, which are basically the emissions of your value chain. And a great benefit of insetting and offsetting is that those credits or impact units are decoupled from the actual product. They can be decoupled, so they're much more flexible. So what does a greenhouse gas methodology entail? Where there is a big list of what it has inside, but I think 3 of the biggest aspects of it are the following. The first one is additionality. So this is basically we need to have a guideline for ensuring that the project is additional, basically that the emissions go above and beyond to what would happen without the project. And we split basically this additionality in 3 different aspects. First of all, regulatory, where we ask, is there a legislative push for such kind of innovation? Because if there is, then the project is not very additional. Similarly, we have prevalence, but this focuses on industry. So if everyone in the industry is doing it, then the project is not additional. And the third one has to do with financial additionality, meaning that if the project is profitable on its own and has not enough revenue, then maybe there is not enough financial additionality. The second part is about actually quantifying the emissions. And it starts by setting up a boundary upon which the emissions are calculated. Very simply, which activities are included in this kind of project to calculate the emissions. The second one is about estimating the baseline. So basically, we want to understand what kind of emissions were happening before the project was implemented. And based on that, we can calculate the reduction. And of course, the third part is the actual calculations, the equations which can describe the reduction. And the third aspect has to do with credibility. A methodology must entail a guideline for verifying, monitoring, and reporting those kinds of emission reductions. And to do that, data and parameters that must be monitored are included. So I think it's time to break this up a little bit and make this webinar a little bit more interactive. So we're going to do a very short poll. Thankfully, Google Meet has the capabilities of doing that internally. So I will launch it now. And to access it, you have to press the little activity button on the bottom right of your screen. And then a drop-down menu will appear where you can select the poll. And the question that we're asking is the following: where do you think the largest emissions related to synthetic nitrogen fertilizers come from? And I'm going to give 1 minute for you to give an answer. Oh, wow, we are already getting a lot of responses. Erna mentioned it also before, but if during the webinar you have any sort of questions, you cannot use the direct chat function, but similarly to the poll function, there is a Q&A one, which you can at any point ask your questions. And I think we are good enough with ending the poll right now. And I'm going to show everyone the results. So basically, the answers were mostly manufacturing and production, and after that, direct emissions from field application, which is actually correct. Even though, based on this study, application, and specifically the direct emissions that come from application of the fertilizers, have the largest proportion. Together with the indirect ones, they have more than 50% of the total emissions. But as you can see, production, along with the nitric acid, is also very substantial. This methodology that I'm going to be presenting in now, and the one that we have been developing for the past months, focuses on the production of the fertilizers. The application, even though it is significant, in reality it is a very difficult and challenging task to measure and estimate and predict. It will take an industry effort to create such methodology, and we have started doing that. But for now, it's on the production side. And how can we reduce this kind of emissions that we just presented? Well, the industry is doing quite a few steps towards there. And just a few examples from the industry. Atlas Agro, the one that Dan presented in Washington, USA. I don't need to say no more. I think Dan went quite deep into it. But basically, they're using renewable energy, electricity, to fuel their production for various fertilizers. Similarly, Atomy in Paraguay wants to produce zero carbon nitrogen to produce their calcium ammonium nitrate fertilizer. And Yara plans to do a very similar task in Norway to produce renewable ammonia, which is one of the key inputs for fertilizer production, to produce ammonia-derived fertilizers. So let's get into it, the methodology. How do we quantify these emissions? Well, as I mentioned before, it all starts from the baseline. So by baseline, we mean what kind of emissions were happening before the new project took place. And right from the get-go, we have two options, two scenarios. The first one is a retrofit, so basically making a change in a current and existing fertilizer production, or a new factory, so something that didn't exist before. The first case is quite simpler because you know what was happening before, you know your customers, you know what was happening, so you can calculate that, and maybe there's a small change in the production phase, so a bit more efficient, for example, so you can calculate the reduction. For the new factory, it is a bit more tricky because you have to understand what your customers or prospective customers are doing. Where are they sourcing their fertilizers now, and how many emissions were happening there? So the methodology contains a guideline as to how the baseline should be set up for each kind of project. The second step is having a boundary. So which kind of activities are included for the calculation of the emissions, both for the baseline and the project. Now, the next couple of slides are going to be in a bit more detail, but bear with me because as the webinar is named Methodology Matters, details matter as well in this case. So we have boiled down basically the activities that are related to fertilizer production in those 10 activities, which all of them are included except for the final one, so the application of the fertilizers, because as I told you, it will take an industry effort to actually calculate that. So we take into account the extraction of raw materials on the upper left side, their transportation to the fertilizer factory, then the upstream emissions from the fossil fuel, as well as the electricity, then the actual production processes and all of the emissions that they entail, and the waste streams, which is their transportation to the facilities where they are managed, as well as their actual treatment. And finally, we have the transportation of the fertilizers to the distributors or the farmers directly, and then the field spreading, so the machinery for spreading these fertilizers. A project might affect one or more of those, but what is important is to have a substantial impact. So let's look a bit deeper on how the calculation would look like in one of those steps. Let's take the middle one, the fertilizer production processes, for instance. So here is the complicated equation, which in reality it's quite simple. It's basically the product of the volume of the fertilizer being produced times an emission factor, which basically tells us how many emissions are being produced per ton of fertilizer produced. And we do that for each process step within the fertilizer factory and for each fertilizer. To that, we also add the fugitive emissions that might come from the valves, for example, by leakage. And there we have it, the equation that we use to calculate the fertilizer production processes. And if we do these equations for all of those activities, we can get the total emissions, which we can calculate for first the baseline, which are substantial, and then for the which hopefully are less. And then we need to subtract those. But as you can see here, to calculate the net greenhouse gas emission reductions, we don't only take the baseline emissions and the project emissions alone, but we have two more factors that we take into consideration. So the first one is also the leakage, which means it's the displacement of increase of emissions. Basically, when you're doing a new project, there is a possibility that somewhere else there is an increase of emissions indirectly. For example, let's assume that we have a new fertilizer factory and it is using green electricity to power the processes. But because the grid might not be able to provide this much amount of green electricity, it needs to increase the gray electricity production. And when I say gray, I mean from fossil fuel. So this indirect increase must also be factored in. And secondly, we have the uncertainty. The reason we have the uncertainty is because we want to be as conservative as possible. And the entire calculation of the reduction is based on the emission factors that I showed you in the previous slide. And those emission factors come with uncertainty ranges, or maybe they came from an older time, so maybe 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago. So then you have an increase in uncertainty, and you need to calculate that and incorporate that into the final net greenhouse gas emission reductions. So let's get a little bit more practical. Let's give an example how this methodology might work or how it could be useful. Let's assume the agriculture industry in Europe. What is happening right now is that there is production both within Europe, but there is also importing fertilizer from multiple countries. Let's assume that we're getting them from Russia, Egypt, and Algeria in those percentages. Because we're getting them from outside of Europe, there are transportation emissions that come along with those. And to add to that, they are probably using the conventional means of producing these fertilizers. And by conventional, I mean using fossil fuel. So based on that, let's make a hypothetical intervention and say that instead of getting those fertilizers from outside of Europe, a new fertilizer factory is constructed where we produce and distribute these fertilizers within the EU. And to add to that, instead of using fossil fuel to produce the fertilizers, we use renewable electricity for their production. And let's also assume that no other intervention takes place related to the raw materials, their extraction, transportation, and the same with waste treatment. So using the methodology that we just presented, we can make some calculations. Here you can see the greenhouse gas which are given in tons of CO2 equivalents per ton of fertilizer produced. And this is done both for the baseline and the project. As you can see, for the baseline, we have three types of emissions: the upstream fossil fuel emissions, the fertilizer production processes, and the transportation of the fertilizers. Note that I have grayed out here the raw materials and waste stream related emissions. And the project one, as you can see, the emissions are significantly reduced. So from 2.6 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of fertilizer produced, we go to approximately 0.3. So we have a 2.3 ton of CO2 equivalent reduction per ton of fertilizer produced. And you might be asking, well, is that significant? Well, yes, it is. And if we also consider the scale, so a typical fertilizer factory might produce anywhere from 100,000 tons up to 500,000, and even more. Then for 100,000, this would be 230,000 tons of CO2 emissions yearly, which is very significant. And those emissions can be translated into carbon finance, which is enough to fuel basically the financial needs of the factory. And the final point we want to make here is about credibility. So the methodology also includes guidelines for monitoring, reporting, and verifying that the emissions that I just presented you are actually real, and it's not something that we just calculated. And why do we need that? We need that because we want to be accurate, transparent, and have integrity in this reduction that we present and claim, so that we can produce some carbon finance that is high quality. For example, these impact units. So very briefly, the process that we follow is the following. First, we take the data and the design parameters, which are estimates, and we make an estimate of the reductions. Then we validate the project, we implement the project, and when we do that, we are able to update the data, the parameters, and all the assumptions that we made. We verify that the emissions are real, and then we can calculate the actual net greenhouse gas emission reductions. What is very important to mention here is that for the validation and verification phases, we involve validation and verification bodies which are external to the project, so that they can bring a more credibility to this project and the emissions that are claimed. So, to conclude, what does a project such as this one, a greenhouse gas project, require? The first one and most important one is impact. To have an impact on emissions, to somehow reduce the emissions that were happening before compared to the baseline and bring something better, more sustainable, let's say. The second one is the need of finance. Because as we said, if the project was hugely financially good beforehand, then it doesn't really make sense. But if there is a need for investment, then it makes sense. And finally, the project must be able to be verified so that we have credibility and transparency in our processes and claims. And I think that's it with the third part of the webinar. And I think we now can move on to the Q&A part, which, as I mentioned before, and Erna, you can find by clicking the activity button and then Q&A and post your questions. I have already seen quite a few questions pop up. And I think I will give it now to Sijbrand to moderate this discussion. I'm muted.
Yeah. Hi there. I hope this will work okay for everybody. So thanks a lot, Konstantinos, and thanks again, Dan, also for your contribution. Just want to highlight again, we're ahead of schedule, so don't hesitate to ask any questions. There's a few questions already. I think the first ones are for Konstantinos actually, so I will try to moderate a bit. I think one of the more interesting questions, maybe, Konstantinos, is a question on the value of uncertainty. So you mentioned, I think, in your presentation that you will basically discount for the uncertainty of a project on the amount of emissions impact that the project would have. Can you tell us or the audience maybe, and there's still quite a few of you, on how this uncertainty is being calculated? Thank you.
Yes. All right. Thank you, Sijbrand. Well, I think this is one of the trickiest part as well of the methodology, because when a project developer wants to calculate this uncertainty, they would want to reduce that as much and get a favorable result. But thankfully, there are already methodologies to calculate this uncertainty. The greenhouse gas protocol already had some guidelines as to how this can be done. But for each project, maybe there are some intricacies, let's say. So we would need to add that and describe that very specifically in our methodology as to how this is calculated. Basically, we need to take into account if the uncertainty factors that we have an uncertainty range, which is good already because we can pick the most conservative value. And then we need to understand, okay, how recent are they? How credible are they? Were they produced for a specific location, for example, or are they global? The more specific we can get in the emission factors, the better.
Okay, thank you, Konstantinos, for answering your question. I've got another one for you, I'm afraid, so you have to talk even more. Yeah, unfortunately, I cannot see who asked the question, but I'm gonna repeat it anyway. So how come the leakage emissions are not already included in the production emissions? Can you elaborate on that a bit, please?
Yes, thank you for the question. Quite a good one. When we say leakage, it's actually two concepts. We have the leakage from the pipes, from the various instruments within the factory. So you might have a leakage from for methane or whatever during transportation. So those are actually included in the calculation of the fertilizer production emissions. It's actually in the example that I gave you. Maybe we could go back. So it's this one, the FE, fugitive emissions, we call them. And then the leakage that we refer here is not about the fugitive emissions that might leak out of the process during the process of the fertilizer production, but it is the displacement of emissions because the project happened. It's not directly in the fertilizer location, the fertilizer production location. It could be elsewhere. So in the example that I gave you, when you had the green electricity that is being used for the fertilizer production, maybe that was not enough for the grid. So they had to increase the gray fertilizer production elsewhere. And this amount needs to be calculated extra at the end and subtracted from the
Thank you, Konstantinos. I hope so too. If not, then there's a Q&A feature in the Google Meet to ask the question again. There's two questions, and I think I'm gonna take those two questions, or maybe anyway, we can have a follow-up later on the actual, I would say, market and market making of the carbon finance. So one question is, okay, do companies already buy and sell carbon credits, or is this still theoretic at this stage? And the other one is a bit related. How can inset credits or impact units help fertilizer manufacturers actually reduce their environmental impact? So let's maybe start with the last one. So if impact units are actually being sold or being bought by supply chain participants, then I would say the income, the revenues of those impact units could support the business case, the co-financing of those sustainability projects. So the example which I think during this presentation was, of course, around Atlas Agro. The income they would get from using from the revenues from the impact units would be used by them to well, basically support the final investment decision and well, make their business worthwhile also from an economic point of view. So it definitely supports their business and has an environmental impact as well. The other question is if this is still theoretic at this stage. I think the honest answer is yes. In the fertilizer industry, it's still theoretic. So we need methodologies such as this in order to be able to credibly issue those credits or impact units. So we're almost there. And we know there's a demand there. So that's for sure. But I think the real practical thing still needs to happen. But we anticipate this to happen in the coming months. So I hope that was an answer to that question. Sorry for talking myself a lot. Maybe one final one before we wrap up. But please, if you have pressing questions, do ask them. So Fiona, do you ask the question? Do you know how much the greener fertilizer product would cost compared to what farmers would use in this case, in a normal case? Maybe Konstantinos, you can elaborate a bit on this, but I think the question that can be made, maybe also be answered by Dan later on.
Okay, thank you for the question, Fiona. Well, that really depends on who is buying and how much they're willing to pay for those for this extra premium, let's say. But most importantly, I think this is the result from the methodology. It's the quantification of the impact. So how green is the fertilizer depends on how much emissions are reduced compared to what was happening before. So this is the quantity, how much. And this also has to do with how much the buyer is willing to pay for it. So the reduction gets translated into either a green premium, as we said, or maybe those impact units. And the cost of these impact units can vary significantly. It can be anywhere from, I don't know, 60, 120 euros, maybe more, but it really depends on the quality of the carbon credits. So I think that's it from my side. Maybe Dan, being on the other side, could elaborate a bit further.
I will go from here. Okay, thank you, Konstantinos. I think Dan is a bit unavailable for answering this question. Maybe another one from Omar. According to it's a good question. GHG protocol, is the CO2 used for urea production counted as an avoided emission? Is that a question I can ask you, Konstantinos, or is that something that we will come back to later on? I'll let you think for this a bit. Another question from Lena is the industry not obliged to reduce emissions? I think I can take some of that question. I think it really depends on, I would say, the regulatory context of the industry. So there's a lot of regulations going on in Europe. So the EU is implementing a lot of regulation, Green Hydrogen Act, and of course, as part of I would say, the bigger Green Deal package. There's other, I would say, jurisdictions around the world where there's no regulation. Yeah, the companies are basically left on their own to implement decarbonization projects, yes or no. So it really depends on the region where the production capacity is located. Maybe again back to Europe, there's going to be a CBAM, so a carbon border adjustment mechanism implemented. So that means that also companies outside Europe will be impacted by European legislation. So it depends a bit. Yeah.
And I can take Omar's question. Thank you very much for that. So the question was, according to the greenhouse gas protocol, is the CO2 used for urea production counted as an avoided emission? So I think what the question really is, it's about urea in itself has carbon inside. So this is kind of sequestration, one might say. So having it saved within the urea. But the thing is, when you apply the urea into the field, so urea is a fertilizer, when you apply it to the field, this is not stored there, but re-released. If the carbon was sequestered within the soil, so stored there for a long time, then you could be able to claim that as an emission reduction, because you're taking it from the air, let's say, and then storing it within the soil. And this is actually the case with other similar fertilizers that can sequester carbon within the soil. But I think for urea specifically, the traditional synthetic fertilizer, that is not the case.
Okay, thanks again. I'm also, because of time, I'm going to do one more question if that with all of you. So the final question is again, unfortunately, to Konstantinos. So there's a question. Okay, the amount of avoided emissions is calculated using a certain benchmark. And what is the long-term outlook for these benchmarks? Can we expect the amount of these avoided emissions to decrease over time and potentially negatively impact the business case? So I think this is around baseline and how long, how do you do this from a crediting period point of view?
That's a great question. This has to do with basically, how does the baseline change over time? So let's say that you're doing an innovative project that can reduce the emissions compared to what the industry is doing. But if after a few years the industry starts catching up, or maybe if there is regulation coming in, then the baseline changes. It is not something that is static, that we calculate today, and in 10 years it will be the same. No, every few years, maybe 3, 5, 6, depending on the industry, you need to reevaluate the baseline to see what is really happening. So you're correct in saying that in a few years, maybe the potential, the greenhouse gas reduction gets reduced. So you are entitled to less credits over time. But maybe you're doing something in an industry that only you are doing, and over the years, the rest of the competition is doing the same. In this case, the baseline remains the same. So it depends, and it is the purpose of the monitoring plan to estimate this baseline throughout the years. And if something changes in the regulation or in the industry, it needs to be accounted for. Hope this answers the question.
So thank you to our speakers. Thank you to, no? Am I good to go now? Okay, so thank you to our speakers. Thank you to our viewers. Thank you for taking the time to join this webinar. Thank you for asking your questions. I imagine that there are questions that you didn't ask or something that will come up. Of course, we see that there are a couple things that sort of were left unanswered. If you have left them under your name, I think we should go through the effort to reach out and answer these questions. So what this was a nice little sneak peek into what Proba is working on with our methodology. Of course, it's not yet ready, but we do expect to have it up and open on our public consultation page soon. And once it is up there, we would love to invite you to collaborate and contribute your ideas on this. This is a collaborative effort to, help support decarbonization efforts in the fertilizer industry. So we're really counting on you once it's up and ready. Now, I also would like to mention that if any of the content from this webinar has resonated with you, whether it be project-wise or you have any questions or this methodology really strikes you, we do want to encourage any kind of questions or just give us a contact, reach out. We can talk about it, we can delve into it. And our contact is hello@proba.earth. And essentially, I think that kind of concludes our webinar here today. So once again, thank you for joining, and the recording will be sent to you following this. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day, evening, morning, wherever you are coming from.